Okay, here's the final lecture of the quarter. Chapter 15, Lecture 2. I hope you all took the opportunity to look through the old video of those masters of psychotherapy. It should do you some good. So we talked about insight-oriented therapies in the last lecture. Today we're going to talk about behavioral therapies and about biological therapies. So, by behavioral therapies, we're talking about therapies that follow the behaviorist model. What are the two basic principles of behaviorism? Number one, observable behavior. Number two, environmental influences that cause people to behave in certain ways. We're going to talk about systematic desensitization, in vivo desensitization, biofeedback, and aversion therapy. So, first, systematic desensitization. This is a very common methodology that is used still. It's over 100 years old, and it works very well. There are 3 steps to it. The first step is you teach the person a deep relaxation methodology. Well, usually that comes in the form of a guided imagery and deepening relaxation. The second step is to create a list of anxiety-producing situations in the person's life. Third, and that's put in a hierarchy from most to least anxiety producing. And then third is the actual desensitization process. So in step 1, what I usually do is I give patients a recording and have them listen to it for every night as they go to sleep for a couple weeks. And by the time they're done, they're pretty good at being able to get into some deep relaxation. Then we start with the least anxiety-producing situation, put them in that deeply relaxed state, which in reality is a minor altered state of consciousness. And then I begin to describe that individual's least anxiety-producing situation. Now, what that does is, because they're in a mild altered state of consciousness and the susceptibility is high, they start to experience the anxiety of that situation. And we don't leave them in the anxiety long. Instead, we pull them right back to that relaxed guided imagery. And they lose their anxiety very, very quickly. And then we take them back to the anxiety-producing circumstance and then back to the relaxation. And we do it enough times that ultimately what ends up happening is the individual learns to be able to relax quite well when anxiety-producing situations come along. And then once you've finished with that first anxiety-producing circumstance, which is the least anxiety-producing, you slowly work your way up the list of the anxiety-producing situations. It works quite well. People usually end up experiencing a significant lack of anxiety because of it. In vivo desensitization. This is also referred to as flooding. Well, the first thing you do with this is you have them go to the doctor and make sure their heart works well, because you don't want to give them a heart attack. Because what you're going to do is take them to the anxiety-producing situation physically and have them use the techniques that they have learned to reduce their anxiety once in the anxiety-producing circumstance. So it's a very real thing. I worked with a gentleman who was a veteran once, and he, as part of his PTSD, was having some great difficulty with just being around people, which is a common symptom for PTSD. I taught him some relaxation techniques, and then at the beginning of our session, we went to Fred Meyer. And we walked up and down the aisles, and he would get anxious as we'd get close to people, and then that would die down. And he kept getting anxious and then working on his anxiety, and it would die down. And by the time we were done, he was doing pretty well. Of course, we worked in treatment for quite a bit after that. Then there's a similar treatment modality, but instead of using relaxation techniques, we use a biofeedback method. That means an individual sits in front of a machine and they are hooked up to the machine. Heart rate, respiration rate, blood pressure, and galvanic skin response. So they have 4 little dials in front of them on the machine, and they sit there and they work at bringing down those measures. And as they bring down those measures, in essence, what they're learning to do is decrease anxiety. Now, if you think about it, what anxiety is a physiological reaction to anxiety-producing circumstances. So, you teach them how to manage their physiological reactions and then begin to present stimuli that is associated with their anxiety-producing circumstances. And so it's similar to these other treatment methodologies, but it's using the biofeedback machine. And then the last of the specific behavioral therapies we're going to discuss is aversion therapy. Aversion therapy is very simple. It's Pavlovian conditioning. Now you remember, Pavlov, classical conditioning, you start with an unconditioned stimulus and an unconditioned response. Now the unconditioned stimulus is a natural stimulus. Not anything you have to condition the person to respond to. And the unconditioned response is just the immediate response. Now what I'm going to describe to you is smell aversion. And I use smell aversion with sex offenders in the sex offender program that I run. And what we do is we have them put together just a nasty smelling concoction where everybody goes home, takes some meats, raw egg, hard-boiled eggs, some milk, blend them up in a blender, and then fill up a masonry jar about halfway, 40%, and then seal it good and tight. Now, I'm not talking about sealing it like you would a mason jar if you were preserving food. You just put the top on. And then you sit it in your windowsill for a couple of weeks. And boy, I'll tell you, the smell that comes out of that thing is just horrific. Now, that is the unconditioned stimulus and the unconditioned response. The smell, and what does it cause? Nausea. Okay? Then we have to have a neutral stimulus. Well, in this case, we're going to use a stimulus that the offenders should respond very negatively to, but they do not. Most likely because of some kind of conditioning in their life. But what I do is I have them write up some vignettes that are brief, a paragraph, a brief story of the anticipatory lead-up of a sexual offense. Now, I don't have them write about the sexual offense itself, but the anticipatory lead-up. which in sexual terms generally means it's usually very arousing. Well, that means there has to be a stimulus, and that means for someone who offended a child, that has to be a child stimuli. If it's someone who is an exhibitionist, then that's going to be a story about exposing oneself. If it's a voyeur, it has to be about some voyeuristic opportunity that they're trying to make available to them. This could even include pornography as a voyeuristic stimulus. Now, the reality is, shouldn't thoughts about sexual contact with a child make us feel sick? Well, of course it should. It's disgusting, and it should make us feel sick. But for some reason, it did not make feel sick some of these individuals, depending on what offense behavior they exhibited. Then, what we do is we take that neutral stimulus that is not producing nausea of the smell, and they read their vignette, their little story. And when they start to experience sexual arousal, they stop, open up the jar, and they don't just go real quick. They go just as hard as they can. And I will tell you, I've put trash cans in the middle of the office floor because we get more than one person retching every time we do this. It's disgusting. And it's nauseating, and it should be. Now that they've tried it in the office, then they go home and with their smartphones, they film themselves. And they send me that video every day so that I know that they have done their aversion therapy every day. By the end of 30 days, all they have to do is think about an inappropriate sexual act and they become nauseous, as they should be. Okay? That's aversion therapy. Again, these are behavioral therapies following Pavlovian or Skinnerian methodologies. Okay, now let's talk about biologically based treatments. Let's talk a little bit about some of the other biologically based treatments other than medications. We will talk about psychopharmacotherapy. But first, let's talk about some others. ECT, electroconvulsive therapy, VNS, vagus nerve stimulation, psychosurgery. So, what is ECT? Electroconvulsive therapy is a treatment modality in which an individual is suffering from severe depression. And they're suffering from this severe depression, and they are very resistant to antidepressant medication. Well, if that's the case, we have to find something that's going to work for them. And believe it or not, shooting electricity in the brain will take that small percentage of depressed people. Remember, they're severely depressed. That's the smallest percentage, and they don't respond to medications well. Of that small percentage of the depressed population, we provide electroconvulsive therapy, which is shooting electricity into the brain. And research tells us that 50% of those individuals, 50% show remarkable positive gains because of their participation in ECT. Now, I don't know how it all got started. I always wonder about the first guy who stood there with two wires saying, hey, how about we stick these on either side of your head and see what happens, you know? Can't imagine how that started, but it started. and it actually is a viable treatment now. It has some nasty side effects, memory loss, some clouded consciousness for the first few days after the treatment, and other things like that. We don't have to worry nearly as much about those nowadays because of the advancements that have been made in electroconvulsive therapy. Usually it's unilateral and not bilateral, not to both sides of the brain. I have a number of patients who participate in regular electroconvulsive therapy, and they actually benefit from it quite well. And the treatment itself only leaves them, a bit fuzzy for a few hours after the treatment, and they don't lose memory any longer. I've worked with some who have lost significant chunks of their memory because of this treatment modality. So, that's electroconvulsive therapy, and it actually does work. Let's talk about VNS, vagus nerve stimulation. Well, the vagus nerve is one of the 13 cranial nerves of the brain. This nerve comes out of the left side of the brain, comes down to the chest, and connects up with the lungs and gives information back to the brain about what's going on with your lungs, and then goes down to your stomach and then sends information back to your brain about what's going on with the stomach. It also receives stimuli coming down from the brain. Well, it was surmised that stimulating the vagus nerve might have some effect on seizure activity, and it actually does. It's used as a seizure treatment. But they found out that individuals who were depressed, who were getting those seizure treatments, actually improved quite a bit. So research was done. Actually, that research was done at the University of Washington. And I worked with one gal who was one of the original clients in that study. And she did remarkably better. It made a significant change in her function. And so what's done is a battery pack is implanted in the chest, and then a wire from the battery pack is attached to the vagus nerve and sends stimuli up to the brain from the vagus nerve. It has frequency settings, intensity settings, and pattern settings that differ for different individuals, and so you have to kind of try it out and get it set just right for that person. So that's vagus nerve stimulation. And psychosurgery. This is when people actually get cut into the brain. Now, there's a horrible old history of psychosurgery in psychology, well, in medicine. In the mid-1950s, there weren't any real medications that actually treated mental disorders. There were medications that could just drug people out. But beyond that, it didn't do them much good. And so a neurosurgeon decided that it would be a good idea to disconnect the frontal lobe from the midbrain. Now you remember we talked about the midbrain, the limbic system, and it has all of those structures in the midbrain that create the physiological activity of emotion. And then we have the frontal lobe that interprets all that information. Well, there is a nerve bundle that connects the frontal lobe to the midbrain, and it was believed that if you severed that, an individual would not have emotions. And individuals at that time had such distorted and disturbed emotions that it seemed better to take that from them. Well, These operations were done for about a year. It just so happened that antidepressants, anti-anxiety medications, antipsychotics, and mood stabilizers were all discovered in about that year. Seems like quite the coincidence, huh? But I actually met a woman who had a frontal lobotomy when I worked years ago in the late 1970s at the Utah State Hospital. And she had no emotion. They performed this surgery by taking a surgical instrument that looks suspiciously like an ice pick, and they stick it right into the edge, the corner over here next to the eye, put it back in the brain at a certain angle, and then they rotate it a certain number of degrees, and it severs that nerve that's going back into the midbrain. And the individual experiences no emotion. Now, at the end of that year, because all these new medications were discovered, frontal lobotomies were discontinued. The Kennedys had their mentally disabled daughter given a frontal lobotomy during that time. Now psychosurgery is done in much more specific ways. Like, you can go into the amygdala, that's the anger and emergency reaction. And the individual can be awake, and they have an electrode that's inserted into the brain and is touching the amygdala. And what they do is they stimulate certain areas of the amygdala, and they find that area that's creating explosive anger, and they zap it. They lesion it is what it is called. They burn that little area. They can be very specific. Still sounds a little barbaric, even though it's quite different than it used to be. Okay, let's talk about medications. So, there are 4 types of psychotropic medications: antidepressants, anti-anxiety medications that are called anxiolytics, antipsychotic medications, and mood stabilizers. So, number 1, antidepressants. These were discovered by accident. They were all discovered by accident, actually. The first antidepressant was actually first marketed, before it was even considered to be an antidepressant, as an antihistamine. And it was an okay antihistamine, but it wasn't great. And it just so happened that people who were taking that antihistamine started to feel better, those who were depressed who were taking that antihistamine. That was seen, and then research was done to determine what was happening. And these were the original antidepressants that, well, they're okay. They can still be used. It's pretty easy to overdose on them, which seems pretty antithetical to the idea of depression. These were the tricyclics and the tetracyclics. There are still some out there being used: Elavil, imipramine, trimipramine, trazodone, amitriptyline. There's probably 1 or 2 of you that have been prescribed trazodone to help you fall asleep. It's an old antidepressant, but after you take it, about 30 minutes after you take it, it just slows everything down and permits you to fall asleep. In the 80s, the SSRIs were discovered. Selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. This is the Prozac family. And you've almost likely heard of many of these medications: Prozac, Zoloft, Paxil, Luvox, Celexa, Lexapro, Vibrid. Each one is another generation where they have weeded out side effects and made the medication a little bit more effective. And some of the medications were designed for very specific aspects of disorders. And then sometime after that, in the early 2000s, we discovered SNRIs, selective norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors. And you remember I explained this to you back when we talked about the neuron, that these medications go in and block the reuptake sites so that the serotonin or the norepinephrine can't be sucked back into the terminal button, instead stays out in the synapse and actually does quite a good job of being permitting the dull dendritic receptors to be able to work, because the chemical is out there longer to permit it to work. And they're very good antidepressants. Serotonin is our balancing neurotransmitter. Norepinephrine is our content and happy neurotransmitter, and sometimes we need to have them be able to function better. So those are the antidepressants. There are others, but these are very atypical antidepressants. We're not going to talk about them. Now we go to the anxiolytics, anti-anxiety medications. And everything I just said about antidepressants also works for anxiety, because anxiety and depression are just opposite sides of the same coin in working with serotonin and norepinephrine. And so all of those can work as anti-anxiety medications. None of them, for the depression or anxiety, work immediately. It takes time for them to build up in the system, and then they begin to affect those symptoms. There are other medications too, though, that are used for anxiety, such as benzodiazepines. Benzodiazepines are minor tranquilizers. These are the ones that all end in PAM that we talked about in Chapter 5. Lorazepam, clonazepam, alprazolam, etc. Lorazepam. So these are Valium, Ativan, Xanax, etc. They can be used as rescue medications. You have to be very careful because they're highly addictive, but they can be used quite well as rescue medications in the midst of a very anxiety-producing circumstance. So, like I said, they can work well. Let's take a look at what else? Are there any other anxiolytics I want to talk to you about? There are actually some pretty good antihistamines that work for anxiety. There's another rescue medication called hydroxyzine that's a pretty good anxiety reducer for as just an antihistamine. So again, these are different medications used. Mostly, though, it's the antidepressants, and most likely the SSRIs and the SNRIs that will help people the most with anxiety. Let's talk about antipsychotic medications. These also were discovered in the early to mid 1950s. These medications were absolutely necessary. People who were psychotic, having hallucinations and delusions, couldn't be controlled. These antipsychotics do a good job of that. The first group were called the phenothiazines. They are major tranquilizers, and the person generally has to get used to becoming less tranquilized by these medications. Names of them. How about Thorazine, or Stelazine, or Prolixin, or Haldol? These are some of the older antipsychotics. We have many new ones. Respirodol, or Geodon, or Remron, or etc. These are antipsychotics that actually do quite a bit better job than the old ones did, mostly because they have fewer side effects. Now, some of the side effects of these antipsychotics are severe, especially the older phenothiazines. They cause what are called extrapyramidal symptoms, and usually those are in the form of tics or strange movements or tightness, muscle tightness. The worst of those extrapyramidal symptoms is called tardive dyskinesia. Tardive dyskinesia is a side effect of these antipsychotics that, if not identified and the person taken off the antipsychotic or treated while they stay on the antipsychotic, if not, then the individual will experience a powerful facial tic that will become permanent. They will never get rid of it again, and it's severe distortions of facial musculature. And you can go online and look up tardive dyskinesia, and you can see some pretty significant examples of what tardive dyskinesia looks like. So we have to be very careful with these medications, but they do make hallucinations and delusions go away. Another medication that many of you may have heard of is Seroquel. Seroquel is used to help people sleep because it's a major tranquilizer, but it's also used for bipolar disorder, manic episodes in which the individual is so manic that they're psychotic. Now, the other disorder that we look at mostly to use with these medications is schizophrenia, and that's used much more frequently than even bipolar disorder. Okay. Well, I left out one type of antidepressant that I should have talked about. These are the MAO inhibitors, monoamine oxidase inhibitors. Monoamine oxidase is the, I can't remember the name of the group of chemicals. It'll come to me later. Monoamine oxidase is what eats up extra leftover neurotransmitter in the synaptic cleft so that there's not too much in there when it shouldn't be in there. Sometimes it is used because people have too much of a neurotransmitter in their synaptic clefts. And so that MAO inhibitor goes in there and eats up some of that so that there's less available, and therefore things function better than they were. Although MAO inhibitors can be very dangerous, it is possible that if people either eat cheese or bananas while they're taking an MAO inhibitor, they could die. So some of these side effects are severe, so they're not used very often. Only when other things have been tried and just haven't worked, then sometimes MAO inhibitors will be used. And let's finally talk about mood stabilizers. Mood stabilizers are what is used for people who are in manic episodes of bipolar disorder. So usually individuals who are suffering from bipolar disorder, manic depressive type, will need both a mood stabilizer to create a ceiling so that their manic episodes don't go up to a manic episode, so it controls it, and an antidepressant so that there's a floor, so that the person's depression doesn't go too low. Recognize that some people with bipolar disorder, if they take antidepressants, it will shoot them up into a manic episode. And if they take mood stabilizers, it may drop them down into a depressive episode. And so there often has to be a very careful what word am I looking for? A very careful combination or cocktail of these different medications that can then help the individual. The first mood stabilizer was an accident. It's lithium chloride. I told you about this earlier, I believe, in a previous lecture, but an Australian psychiatrist decided that his patients had too much sodium chloride in their diet, table salt. And so he gave them a salt substitute, and a common salt substitute is lithium chloride. It tastes like table salt too. Well, about half of his people, clearly, who were suffering from bipolar disorder, got lots better. And then they started using lithium chloride to try to figure out how to treat manic episodes. It's actually a good medication. The only problem is lithium can be toxic. It can poison the person. So they have to be in a certain range in their blood system that is high enough to give therapeutic benefit, but not too high that it becomes toxic. They have to take frequent blood draws to measure that. But at the time, lithium chloride was also being used, and still is used every so often nowadays, as an anticonvulsant, an anti-seizure medication. And lo and behold, lots of the other anti-seizure medications that we use are also good mood stabilizers, like Lamictal or Lamotrigine, or Depakote. All of these many medications are anti-seizure medications or anticonvulsants, but they also do a good job creating that ceiling for the manic episodes. It's very interesting to watch how all of these things came to be and how they can make a major difference in people's lives, but they truly can. The final thing I'd like to talk to you about is deinstitutionalization. The concept of deinstitutionalization simply means that we want people to be in the least restrictive environment in which they can be, so that they are not a danger to themselves or others. Well, our mental hospitals were overfull. 3, 4, 5 times the number of people in these hospitals than should have been in them, or at least that they were designed for. Back in the mid-50s and into the early 60s. Well, we all of a sudden had this major influx of all these medications that permitted people to have diminished symptoms and be able to live outside of these institutions. And literally the institutions were down to half or a quarter full within a few years after the discovery of these new medications, which was a great thing. People shouldn't be in an institution if they don't need to be. Nowadays, there are very, very specific laws. These are civil rights issues associated with whether or not a person can be hospitalized against their will. And it's very, very unlikely nowadays for a person to be hospitalized against their will unless there is clear evidence that the person is a risk to self or others. And that risk, it has to be very pronounced. It has to be very, very clear. That deinstitutionalization was also supported by JFK. He signed the Community Mental Health Centers Act, where every county in the United States has to have its own community mental health center that treats individuals who otherwise would not be able to obtain treatment. In our county, here in Vancouver, in Clark County, we have Columbia River Mental Health. That is our community mental health center, and it treats lots of folks. Of course, they're always overwhelmed, but I know lots of folks who provide very, very good services for individuals who are struggling with mental illness. So there's the overall picture of how we treat mental illnesses in a lot of different ways, mental disorders in a lot of different ways. Hopefully, again, you look at the 3 different types of psychotherapy that we talked about that's available to you on Canvas. It will teach you quite a bit. And beyond that, this is our last lecture. Thanks for listening to me. Sorry you had to. Hope you had a good experience with the class, and mostly hope you learned something. Thanks much, and hopefully we'll meet someday when we're not all quarantined. Thank you very much. Bye-bye now.